Week 12 is here, and if you've been playing fantasy this year, you already know that the wide receiver landscape has not stopped shifting. Breakouts, letdowns, volume swings, and a few rising stars are shaking up the top 36 every week. So let's break down where the dust is settled headed into this week's matchups. What's up, Headliner Nation? My name is Brad, the Rankings King, and before we dive into this week's rankings, just a reminder that these are the consensus rankings from the Headliners team. And for more detailed analysis, check out the start-sit videos from Kyle already posted this week. If you want even more breakdowns each week, join the Fantasy Headliners community by hitting that join button below. That's going to get you access to extra rankings like flex, kicker, defense, and a spot inside of our Discord. Now, before we head into Week 12, we've got a few hits and misses from last week. Our first hit was Nico Collins, and another week of no CJ Stroud, and no problem. We ranked him inside of tier 1, and he finished at wide receiver 4. Our next hit was T. Higgins, and he continues to be a wide receiver 2 with Joe Flacco. We had him at wide receiver 15, and he finished right at wide receiver 15. Next up, we've got A.J. Brown, and y'all know that we aren't A.J. truthers, but a lot of people believe the squeaky wheel was about to be greased. We kept him all the way outside the top 25, and he finished at wide receiver 29. Okay, so there's our hits, but what about our misses? And we start with Michael Wilson. Filling in for Marvin Harrison is one thing, but getting 15 catches for 185 yards is not something that anyone expected. Also, what about Tet McMillan? Finally, the King Tet game that we have been waiting on forever. He was a Verge top 20 guy for us, but he exploded and finished at wide receiver 1. And next up is Christian Watson, and the volume wasn't great, which is what was expected, but the 2 touchdowns was enough for us to have him too low in week 11. Okay, that's it for the hits and misses. Let's turn the page to week 12 in tier 1. We have Jackson Smith-Njigba, Puka Nacua, Amon-Ra St. Brown, CeeDee Lamb, Rashee Rice, Davante Adams, George Pickens, and Nico Collins. At number 1, we have Jackson Smith-Njigba, and JSN is the only wide receiver in the NFL to score at least 10 fantasy points and play in all of his regular season games thus far. He's the overall wide receiver 1 and now gets Tennessee, who allows the 8th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Next up is Puka Nacua coming in at the number 2 spot, and Puka scores 10 points in week 11, and it's a letdown. In a matchup this week against Tampa Bay, there's a lot of offense expected, and Tampa allows over 27 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. At number 3, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown, and 2 catches for 42 yards in week 11 absolutely sucked. But don't get discouraged. Somehow in that game, he still saw 12 targets. He just couldn't bring them all in. The volume is still huge, and the matchup is great against New York this week. At number 4, we have CeeDee Lamb, and 1 drop pass kept us from a huge CeeDee Lamb week in week 11. Week 1 against this Philly defense, he brought in 7 catches for 110 yards. Now, George Pickens is feasting right now, though, but Lamb should continue to see close to double-digit targets. At number 5, we have Rashee Rice, and Rice struggled in week 11 against Denver. We would love to see him in the slot in week 12 so that he can avoid Sauce Gardner on the outside. It is worth noting that his slot rate has dropped from 50% to 35% over the last 2 years, though. At number 6, we have Davante Adams, and week 11 may be one of the craziest stat lines I've ever seen for a wide receiver. 8 targets, 1 catch, 1 yard, 1 touchdown. That was in a tough divisional matchup against Seattle, and this one against Tampa should be easier to move the ball through the air. At number 7, we have George Pickens, and he has to be one of the hottest wide receivers in fantasy right now. He has had 10 plus fantasy points in every game with the exception of week 1. The way that he's utilizing this offense is way different than what it was back in week 1 when these 2 teams faced off. And at number 8, we have Nico Collins, and CJ Stroud has already been ruled out, which is fine for Nico Collins owners. Nico has had 19 plus fantasy points in back-to-back games with Davis Mills as his quarterback, and with Buffalo favored to win, Houston should be throwing the ball the entire game. Okay, that's it for tier 1. And before we head into the next tier, I want to make sure that you're all set up on Underdog. You already know that we've been crushing those player pick'ems on Underdog this year, so what are you waiting for? Head over to Underdog Fantasy or download the app. Create a new account using the referral code HEADLINERS when you do so. Then just make your initial deposit and come join a contest. If you sign up with that promo code, again, it's HEADLINERS, you'll get access to all of the promos that Underdog offers weekly. And check this out. Once you play your first $5, they're going to give you $100 in bonus funds. So you play 5, you get 100. It's that easy. And don't forget, Jake is also going to be breaking down the best picks weekly in our show on Fridays. And links to join are in the description. And we look forward to playing with you on Underdog this week. All right, baby, let's turn it on to tier 2. We've got Emeka Egbuka, Justin Jefferson, Chris Olave, Stephon Diggs, T. Higgins, Ted McMillan, Jameson Williams, Zay Flowers, and Michael Wilson. At number 9, we have Emeka Egbuka, and the volume is still there for Egbuka, and he's had at least 9 targets in 4 straight games. The bigger issue is he's failed to go over 60 yards in 4 of his last 5. Luckily, in a matchup against the Rams, they are much easier to throw on than to run on. At number 10, we have Justin Jefferson, and Dollar General Kirk Cousins, JJ McCarthy, has just killed the production of Justin Jefferson. He has now gone 5 games with McCarthy at quarterback, where he hasn't even reached 90 yards receiving. Now he gets a Green Bay defense who's been playing well against the pass lately. At number 11, we have Chris Olave, and this should be a great spot for Olave to excel in Week 12. The Atlanta passing defense has been non-existent, and last weekend, they allowed Bryce Young to set a franchise record with almost 450 passing yards. At number 12, we have Stephon Diggs, and Diggs has gone 4 straight games with either 100 yards receiving or a touchdown. He's had 19 targets over the last 2 games. Kayshon Boutte is still questionable to play, and this week he gets a great matchup going up against the Cincinnati Bengals. At 13, we have T. Higgins, and Higgins has 5 touchdowns over the last 4 games with Joe Flacco. And a lot of that is due to Chase taking away so much of the defensive attention. Well, Chase is suspended this week, so Higgins should see increased volume and increased defensive attention. At number 14, we have King Ted McMillan, and it took until November, but the Ted breakout game finally happened. He's coming off his best game of the year, and now he gets to go against San Francisco, who was just torched by Michael Wilson and the Arizona Cardinals. At 15, we have Jameson Williams, and Dan Campbell taking over play calling duties is exactly what every Jameson Williams owner needed. He's now had 6+ targets and a touchdown in 3 straight games. Now he gets a Giants defense that allows the 6th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. At 16, we have Zay Flowers, and at this point, Flowers is a reliable 10-point-a-week guy. He's averaging 10.4 fantasy points per game and is the current wide receiver 25. The matchup this week against the Jets, though, will be one of the easiest that he's had in a couple of weeks. At 17, we have Michael Wilson, and Wilson exploded with Marv out last week. 15 catches for 185 yards is massive. What's crazy is that Arizona has a wide receiver capable of that. They don't even use him weekly. Well, Marv has already been ruled out in Week 12, and the Jags allow over 27 fantasy points per game to wide receivers. All right, that's it for tier 2. Now let's look at tier 3. We have Devontae Smith, Rome Odunze, Michael Pittman, A.J. Brown, DK Metcalf, Alec Pierce, Wan'Dale Robinson, Juwan Jennings, and Christian Watson. At 18, we have Devontae Smith, and it's really mind-blowing how bad the Philly pass game can be at times. Smith having only 1 catch for 8 yards in a game against Detroit is nuts. The matchup this week, though, is way better against Dallas, but that Dallas defense is also much improved. At 19, we have Rome Odunze, and we've gone from bad luck drops and penalties to decreased volume over the last 6 weeks. On paper, this is a great matchup against Pittsburgh, but their defense has been much improved over the last couple of weeks, so this will not be an easy game. At number 20, we have Michael Pittman, and a lot of the talk in this offense has gone the way of Alec Pierce, partly because Pittman had his worst game of the season 2 weeks ago just before the bye. Unfortunately, he runs into a Kansas City defense that allows the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers. At 21, we have A.J. Brown, and Philly made a conscious effort to force feed the ball to Brown in Week 11. He had a season-high 11 targets. Those 11 targets resulted in 7 catches for 49 yards, and he finished at wide receiver 28 on the week. It's just impossible to trust him at this point. At number 22, we have DK Metcalf, and it's crazy how you see George Pickens thriving in Dallas. At the same time, you see DK Metcalf being exactly what George Pickens was in Pittsburgh the last few years. If that doesn't tell you that coaching plays a part, I don't know what else will. At number 23, we have Alec Pierce, and fantasy players are loving Pierce. He's had 12+ points in 3 of his last 4, and he's made a catch of 30 yards or more in 4 straight. He's relying on the deep ball and has a tough matchup this week against Kansas City, though. He'll be a Verge top 24 guy this week. At number 24, we have Wan'Dale Robinson. And if you play in full PPR, Robinson is basically a locked-in weekly flex. His yardage isn't great, but he's had 9+ targets in 4 of the last 5. The Giants are optimistic that Dart returns this week, and against Detroit, Wan'Dale should once again see 10+ targets. And at 25, we have Jauan Jennings, and Pearsall and Purdy returned in week 11, and San Fran got out to a big lead, so they didn't need Jennings much. The Pearsall return could hurt Jennings' volume, and the Panthers matchup this week is tough. They allow the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers. And at number 26, we have Christian Watson, and guys, this all comes down to touchdowns. The volume and yardage just isn't high enough to be startable if he doesn't find the end zone, and this Minnesota secondary has played great as of late against Chicago and Baltimore. All right, that's it for tier 3. Now let's move it on to tier 4. We have Romeo Doubs, Khalil Shakir, Ricky Pearsall, Darnell Mooney, Xavier Worthy, Jordan Addison, Tez Johnson, Parker Washington, Jacoby Myers, and Mack Hollins. At number 27, we have Romeo Doubs. And with so many pass-catching options in Green Bay, we can say the same for Doubs as we do for Watson. Most week, the yardage and volume isn't high enough to support starting him if he doesn't score. And Doubs hasn't had a touchdown in 6 weeks. At number 28, we have Khalil Shakir. And in a game with 76 points scored and a 300-yard game from Josh Allen, it's crazy to see Shakir with -3 yards. The guy has had 6+ receptions in 4 of his last games prior to last week. Now he gets Houston, who allows the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers. At number 29, we have Ricky Pearsall, and his first game back was, shall we say, underwhelming. But let's not lose sight of the fact that it was both his and Purdy's first game back. This isn't an easy matchup against Carolina, but you have to think that Pearsall gets more and more opportunities each week. At 30, we have Darnell Mooney, and no Drake London means more volume going the way of Darnell Mooney. The Saints are an average pass defense, so the matchup isn't bad. We just need Kirk Cousins to have a Joe Flacco-esque resurgence. At number 31, we have Xavier Worthy, and it's crazy how Kelsey continues to produce while Worthy continues to get scraps. He's only gone over 50 yards receiving 1 time since the first week of October. He just isn't getting the big play shots that many people expected. At number 32, we have Jordan Addison, and Timu Kirk Cousins just couldn't get the football to his pass catchers. Over the last 3 weeks, Addison has 23 targets, but only 7 receptions, and that has been in pretty favorable matchups. This one against Green Bay will be even more difficult. At number 33, we have Tez Johnson, and Tez just had his worst game of the year since becoming a starter. It was a difficult matchup against Buffalo, and the one this week should be much easier against the Rams, who are easier to throw on than to run on. At 34, we have Parker Washington, and in a game in which they trailed by almost 30 points, it was discouraging to see Washington get 2 catches for only 20 yards. The game this week should be a closer matchup against Arizona, and hopefully he can get back to that 7 to 10 target range. At number 35, we have Jacoby Myers, and Myers just had his best game as a Jag with 5 catches for 64 yards. In a game that could turn into a back and forth matchup against Arizona, he could have a similar stat line and be a flex option in week 12. At 36, we have Mack Hollins, and with Kayshon Boutte still questionable to play, we could be looking at another week of deep balls going the way of Mack Hollins. He's had 8+ fantasy points in 3 of his last 4, and he could be a decent flex play against a below-average Cincinnati defense. All right, so there's your top 36 wide receivers in tiers 1, 2, 3, and 4. And a couple of guys on the outside looking in are DJ Moore, Trey Tucker, Jerry Jeudy, Rashid Shaheed, and Josh Downs. And that's your wide receiver rankings for week 12. Tell us who's in your lineup, who's riding your bench, and which sleeper are you betting on. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join the community for even more weekly breakdowns. Let's go get a W this week, Headliner Nation.
Analytics off the chain, all the channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game.